where we left off, pretty much all of the Maccabee brothers have been slain at this point. We've lost Judah. We had the guy who killed the elephant, Eleazar. And then Jonathan had kind of taken on that role of prince and high priest. And they're kind of like taking that idea of prince instead of king, because it's been almost 500 years. Think about the last king was Zedekiah, sorry. Zedekiah at 589, he was taken captive to Babylon. So he was the last king of Israel or Judea. So we haven't had one. So they're not even taking on the title king, taking on this title prince. And then Jonathan is captured by Trypho and he's executed. And we're left with Simon Thassi. He's the last of the Maccabees, last of the 5 brothers that fought the Greeks. With me so far? All right. And he was called the wise, but he made some unwise decisions. Like even with Judah, he made an alliance with Rome, and then next battle he dies. Where it's like, wow, everything's just going so well, and then he dies. Like if he had just made an alliance with God instead of trying to seek help from pagans, would have things gone better for him? We kind of see the same pattern with the other Maccabees. And Simon Thassi, he at this point, they're still under Greek control in Judea. Judea is very small, so the governor of Jericho is a Greek. And he marries his daughter off to her, political, try to, make some balance there, stop the fighting. So anyone seen Game of Thrones, The Red Wedding? Heard about the Red Wedding, at least. This is pretty much a Red Wedding thing that happens there, where Simon Thassi and his 2 sons, which are going to be the next high priests and rulers, and his wife, all go to this banquet at Jericho. And they're just myrtleized, them and any of their bodyguards just taken out. But there was one son who was not at this banquet. Can you guess who that is? Mr. John here, John Hyrcanus, who's not called Hyrcanus yet. That's the name he's given. There's a little picture of Jericho. It's modern day, but you can see how it would make a good fortress, right? A lot of these Dead Sea fortress, kind of like reminds me of Colorado, like the flat top mesas. And I'm sure you guys have heard of Masada, which is also a Dead Sea fortress that Herod the Great builds later on, the time of Jesus. So anyways, John he's a priest, so he's all these Maccabees were Levites, and he's sleeping in the temple complex, and this Ptolemy, which is confusing because Ptolemy is a Seleucid, he's a Greek. And he's the governor of Jericho, so he notices John's not there, and he's like, I need to kill the whole family. So he sends 2 assassins to try to take out John while he's sleeping. And I like to think that John became John Wick and just took out these 2 guys, as the story goes. And, they came in with swords and left with swords through them, kind of idea. So at this point, he's the youngest. He was never meant to be high priest. He's never meant to be prince. He's just been a general at this point. Now he has to do his first sacrifice and pretty much go to war. So he goes to Dock, is the name of the fortress at Jericho. And he gets there, and his mother is still alive, and they're holding her atop the wall. And he's telling him to turn back, or he's gonna murder his mom. And famously, his mother is recorded in Josephus, calls from the wall. And I've memorized this just for you guys. now I've said I memorized it, but forget it. I forget the first line. Do not grow remiss at my account, but indulge your indignation much the more. Take the fortress. This is your kingdom, my son, and there is an enemy within it. And if I die, let me die for you, lest it all be snatched away. So John pretty much begins the siege while they're torturing his mother on the wall, and he has to take down this whole fortress. Now, the guy in the background, probably even instigated all this, is another Antiochus. We're on number 7, I think. So his name's Cede, Antiochus Cede. I know that's a weird spelling there. Also known as the Pious, which is given to him by the Jews, which we'll get to in a second. Wasn't very pious, though. So, obviously, John, kills this governor, this Greek governor, so Seleucids have to respond. They come down and invade Judea for the 1,000th time at this point. And again, Jerusalem's under siege. So John does very good. He holds off very well. And he's already had a a battle already with Antiochus VII where he kicked his butt. So he remembers him, and they kind of remember the Maccabees at this point. I shared before in the other videos that there's this theme of if you can't beat the Jews if they're being righteous, if they're following God, you can't beat them no matter. Remember Abraham and his 318 men taking out the 4 generals of the north. Some 80,000 guys, right? But if you get them to sin and they're living in sin, it's like taking candy from a baby. So John eventually has to, surrender, and the Greeks again, they want to, put a garrison in Jerusalem and all this and occupy it. And John makes a deal with them. He's like, all right, I'll give you some silver from, he opens David's grave, his sepulcher, and gives him some silver. But he's like, you can't put a garrison here, but what I'll do is I'll give you myself, which I thought was really awesome. And Antiochus, he's intrigued by this. He's like, all right, I'll take you. And he leaves Jerusalem alone. He takes John. So we have high priest and prince John living in exile in the north. He's a general in the army. He's leading Greek troops to fight the Parthians. And he's one of the few Maccabees, one of the few Hasmoneans that is a Pharisee. This is where we start to see the divisions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So it's very interesting that he takes on this role. So he's keeping the Sabbath days, he's keeping the feast days, he's living righteously all by himself in the north. I'm sure there's Greek soldiers underneath him. Like, what are you doing? maybe even converting to Judaism, which is really cool. I'm going ahead here. I'm not going off my slides, so sorry. But here's the actual picture of that invasion of Jerusalem. Some siege towers and cool stuff. So eventually Antiochus VII, he dies in battle. I would like to think that John was the one who took him out, but apparently he was not in that same area. But who knows? That'd be a cool story. We can embellish a little bit. And he also earns the name Hyrcanus this time. So that's where he gets that famous name Hyrcanus. And that's where Josh was confused, because there's a Hyrcanus II. And it's very confusing. Just like we have Antiochus VII. And unfortunately, they don't give us numbers in the Book of Maccabees and Josephus. They kind of have to give you names like Antiochus the Pious, where you kind of figure out who they're talking about, because it does get very confusing. Just like naming that governor Ptolemy when there's 20 other Ptolemies. And then this other... The fourth one. The third is Antiochus the Great, which is the story of 3rd Maccabees. So you just remember 3 and 3. So he dies, and John immediately books it back. He's like, I don't care about the Parthians anymore. You guys deal with them. Just heads back to Judea. At this point, he remembers, okay, don't we have an alliance with Rome that my uncle, his uncle Judah had set up? So he sends an envoy to Rome, and for the first time, Judea is finally sovereign and free. You can see, if you look at every decade, the Seleucid Empire was massive. It's huge, as big as the Persian Empire, just slowly shrinking, losing territory. So they're busy. So Judea is finally, and you can kind of see here on the little map where Judea is in green. It's very small. There's Jericho, very tiny of what it used to be in the times of David and Solomon. And this is around 128. So finally free. He's still prince, still high priest. His people, they hated him while he was in exile. They didn't understand what he was doing this for. But now that he's back, he's starting to be revered again, and things are going really well. And this is where, the Hyrcanus of legend comes into play, which isn't so great. Because up to this point, he was doing really good. But I think I have a slide here. Ultimate power corrupts ultimately, right? So now it's kind of going to his head. So what he does, and let me go back. Can I go back? Yeah, so you can see Samaria and Idumea there on either side, north and south of Judea. Okay, so Idumea is Edom. Just think about it that way. So yeah, the Edomites are still hanging around. And what he does is he conquers Samaria and he conquers Edom. Now, you couldn't pay taxes if you weren't converted to Judaism. And you couldn't also be conscripted to the army if you weren't converted to Judaism and circumcised and all that. So what he does to the Edomites is he forcibly converts all the Edomites, which probably involves some painful circumcision. And the Pharisees don't like this because the Pharisees are very open. They're used to living. A lot of them lived in the Galilee region amongst Gentiles, so this is seen as a very wrong thing. But John at this point kind of has to go be part of the Sadducees, which were more the upper class and rich, and actually less religious, so less Torah observant, if you will. And another thing that I thought was interesting, and maybe Josh can give his opinion on this later, and there's mention of this in Josephus, that there was a temple that the Oneids were trying to get started in Egypt. And this is all taken off of a out of context verse in Isaiah saying there will be an altar in Egypt. So we're like, we'll start our own temple. Because if you remember, Onias III, I think from part 3 or part 4, was pretty much the last true Levitical high priest, in my opinion. Yeah, and he was also myrtleized along with everyone else. And then we've had a lot of priests change-ups here, like Josh mentioned the Hasidians, and we mentioned that the Hasidians didn't like this whole Maccabee high priesthood control, because they even went to this guy who sided with, what is it, the Seleucids? It's alchemists. Yeah, alchemists. And they're like, we want you as high priest because you're of the line of Aaron. And he's like, okay. And then he myrtleized 60 of them. So lots of myrtleization. And we're just getting there. We're just really... want to hit this later. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but there's lots of conflict to come between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It really helps you understand a little bit more once you get to the Gospels, like what the heck went on between these two parties. All right. I felt like I lost my place there, but yeah, there's this, and it's even mentioned in Josephus that this temple is destroyed after the Jerusalem temple is destroyed in 70 AD, after the Romans destroyed. Like, they're like, there's another one? Let's destroy that too, because we don't want any more uprisings from the Jews. If you want more quick information, I've watched a lot of this guy's videos. They're really short, unlike mine. So Sam, I don't know, Aronav's channel on YouTube. There's a little picture from his. So he does a lot of just really quick, less religious versions. So pretty much what I'm doing. All right. And then, that's pretty much all I got there. So I'll just quickly jump through what happens after John. So John nears the end of his life. And he has 2 sons. So he's now Sadducee, but he wants to, because the Pharisees don't like what's happening. And they're like, you shouldn't be prince and high priest. That's not how things were outlined. In Jacob, you say, the scepter belongs to Judah, the priesthood should belong to Levite. So he needs to relinquish this priesthood. So he splits it between his 2 sons. And that's pretty good until he dies. And then, of course, they want to fight each other. And one of his sons was married to this lady named Alexandra, which is a great name. And she, there's this whole little battle we'll get into between the 2 sons. Eventually, they end up myrtleizing each other. Well, one dies of appendicitis, the other one just one that with appendicitis kills the other one. And behind the scenes, Alexandra, who is much older than the younger brother, and this is what Josh said about Eunaeus or Janaeus, she marries him. So he'd be the younger brother. Again, it's the younger brother. So it's like Jacob. It's always the younger brother. It's Joseph's the younger brother that ends up taking control. So Alexandra and Alexander are king, queen. So this would be the first king we see. Not them, but Aristobulus the first would have been the first king. So right after John dies, he's like, I'm king and high priest. And which is always interesting when we think about like the book of Hebrews, where we're talking about Jesus being the king priest. We're like, wait a minute, what's happening here? And even the context of this is where I was going with that temple in Egypt is, were they thinking they're in a millennial reign context? I definitely think the Sadducees were thinking that we are ushering in the kingdom of promise. And I'm sure Aristobulus, people like Aristobulus, and I think we even have, we've got the names there. Oh, kind of. They're cut off, sorry. You can kind of see them on the right there, the different colors. You can see the Jonathan and Simon. These are the Maccabees, and we have Hyrcanus, and the expansions that we see. You can see that Janaeus definitely carved out a lot of land. But He's the purple, yeah. So he's a naughty boy too, and I want to spend more time talking on him. But he dies, and he sets up the only ruling queen ever, which would be Queen Alexandra, and she brings the most peace that Israel ever saw, and she's the last ruler as well before the Herods. So I kind of brought us at least to the Herods, which is a whole story in itself, but I'll stop there. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing.